Fantastic. So good to see you all, and so good to see you, Seth, here. Before digging into today's topics, I think that a lot of people here know about the 50 years from the beginning, you obviously being one of the pioneers in the whole impact space. But for those who haven't heard about 50 years before, what would be the 2-minute intro to the history and background?
Yeah, so essentially at 50 years, we believe that the greatest lever for creating positive change in the world is not politics or nonprofits, it's technology innovation. And market forces. And when I first got exposed to Silicon Valley, I was just blown away by the speed and the scale of it. But on the flip side, I was super disillusioned because you'd meet a brilliant machine learning engineer who would be building a literal dog walking CRM. Or I met a founder who sold his first company for $500 million, and he was going to start another company. And I thought, wow, this is it. This is when you do the audacious thing, thinking it was going to be some space exploration company, and it was an online sneaker marketplace. And so I saw this place that could fundamentally shape the world for the better with a bunch of people who were focusing on smaller things. And so I got really obsessed with how can we help redirect the speed and scale and the potential of technology entrepreneurship toward the civilizationally important problems. And so that's what 50 Years does. We support founders doing that. We're a pre-seed and seed firm. We've been around for 9 years. We've backed over 100 deep tech startups. 20% of the teams that we backed in our first fund are now unicorns. YC brags about their 5%. Sequoia brags about their 7%. So that literally is the highest number I've heard. Haven't heard a higher number yet. So so far it's working pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, wow. In this audience, feel free to brag as much as you want. I think we can all learn a lot from the journey you've been on. But would love to double-click particularly today on what you're doing within the deep tech space. So to just start out with the, if you will, problem statement or opportunity space, tell us more when you got the idea for 50/50. What was it you saw then?
Yeah, so first, maybe it's useful to say why deep tech. Deep tech is a phrase for companies that are really hard to build, right? Often you need a PhD on the team to pull things off. Oftentimes there's a lot of technical risk, right? So the question is, can you actually build the thing you want to build, which is not the case in most software startups. Why would you bother doing something that's much harder? And I think the reason for us is that the big problems that still exist in the world would have been solved if we could have solved them with software companies, right? If we could have solved the climate crisis with a SaaS app, we would have done it. We've been pretty good at building them. If we could solve aging with a mobile app, we would have done it. These really big problems remain because they require really hard solutions, and really hard solutions manifested into physical form are basically deep tech startups. So that's why deep tech. And now, throughout history, academia has been maybe the greatest engine of innovation we've ever seen. But innovation from academia doesn't automatically create a better world, right? Oftentimes what happens is a scientist figures out some new way of doing things. They write a paper about it. That paper gets published and then sits on a shelf, and then that's it. It never actually improves the state of the world and never improves the lives of people. And the reason for that is that someone needs to take that innovation and turn it into a product or service and then scale it to the world. This is basically how almost all science actually improves the state of the world. And the journey from PhD to founder is a really, really hard one. And so we built a program called 50/50 to help solve that. So it's a 5-month, completely free, no equity, no obligation program where we take 50 brilliant scientists from top labs around the world and some engineers from places like Tesla and SpaceX. And then over the course of 5 months, we teach them everything they need to get ready to start. We've had 200 scientists go through. We've had 45 companies get started, which we're really happy about. We've been running this in the US now for a couple years, and an organization called ARIA in the UK, it's the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, just lobbied us and gave us a budget to bring it to the UK. So we're now going to be bringing this to Europe, which we're really excited about. If it works in the UK, the goal is to sort of expand beyond the UK too.
And I'm super curious to, first of all, some of those like design choices of why you set it up the way you did. I suppose that, there would be a lot of people, I suppose, that would agree with the analysis of that there's great innovation in the research lab that don't hit the market. But then I could also imagine that there could be a lot of different theories of like what would be the best way. Do you take the PhDs, or do we help them to sell their patents to a big corporation or team them up with an entrepreneur? So tell us more about why you choose to like work with the PhDs and make them founders.
Yeah, so I think there's been basically 3 chapters in commercializing science from academia. Chapter 1 was a VC or a large company would go to a tech transfer office. And what is a tech transfer office? For those of you that probably have never heard this term, when a PhD at a university invents some new science, they don't actually own the IP to that. The university owns the IP to that, with very rare exception. And so if a PhD wants to start a company off of their own research, they actually have to get rights to the IP from the tech transfer office. That's the office at the university that holds the IP. So phase one was VC firm or company would go to the tech transfer office directly and say, hey, what IP do you have for me today? And then they would license IP they thought might make for a good business. If they were a large company, that IP would probably just sit on a shelf somewhere and not go anywhere. A VC firm would try and create a company around it, but those companies didn't work well because none of the innovators, none of the people who actually invented the technology were involved with the company. So that gave the way to phase two, where VC firms would go directly to professors, the people who ran the academic labs, and say, hey, if you invent something that might be the basis of a company, let me know, and we'll start a company with you. And then the VC firm would start a company, the professor would become a scientific co-founder, i.e. a part-time advisor. They would get maybe 20%, and the VC firm would build a team. And this worked a little bit better because now at least someone involved in developing the technology is involved in the company. But it's probably the professor's fifth priority in life, and so it doesn't work very, very well. And so what we're trying to pioneer is phase three, where we go directly to the PhDs and postdocs. These are the people who actually had the idea, who actually figured out how to make it work, who wrote 95% of the paper, even if the professors often like to take the credit. We're going directly to the innovators and saying, listen, if you think the best way of manifesting the impact of your research is to start a company, we will equip you with everything you need to start. And in our minds, this syncs up really nicely with what happened in software. So back in the day in software investing, the nerds would build a thing, the nerds being the developers. And it would start to get traction, and some VC would come, and they'd say, oh, wow, you got some good traction. We're going to invest in your company, and alongside our investment, we're going to hire a professional CEO, and you're going to work for that CEO now. And that was just the way it worked. If you wanted to raise from VCs, that's what you had to do. And then at some point, some stubborn nerd was like, no, I want to be the CEO. And the VC was like, oh, grumble, this is a terrible idea, but fine, you can be the CEO. And guess what? It works way better, right? Because it turns out it's much easier to teach a deeply innovative person how to business than it is to teach someone who knows how to business how to be deeply innovative. And if you look at the top 15 market cap software companies, all of them had developer founder CEOs now. All of them knew how to code, basically. And so for some reason, deep tech entrepreneurship is still stuck in that old paradigm, right? Even though in software now, any smart VC is like, of course you want a developer CEO. For some reason, the idea of a PhD CEO is frowned upon, and people think you have to bring in some MBA to run the company, and we're trying to change that. And so we're trying to change that by teaching PhDs not only the knowledge and skills they need, that's sort of half the program, but the second half of the program is, what traits do you have to build up in yourself to become a great founder? And this is a lot of coaching, it's softer work. It's how do you identify your limiting beliefs and get rid of them? How do you dial up your audacity? How do you, in the face of everyone around you telling you your idea is terrible, maintain your enthusiasm for it? And this involves journaling and coaching and ice baths and a bunch of soft stuff like that.
Ice baths?
Ice baths.
I love it. Okay, it sounds like a program for more than PhDs. But so while you've been running it now, has there been some hypothesis you had that turned out to be completely wrong in terms of what type of skills people would come in with, or what type of skills that people would need on this journey?
I think it's one of these things where we launch a lot of experiments at 50 years, and oftentimes we launch something and it doesn't work and we shut it down. This is one of those things where we sort of had this hypothesis that it could help great PhDs and postdocs start companies, and it has helped great PhDs and postdocs start companies, and they love it and we love it. And so actually there hasn't really been a thesis about it yet that hasn't worked. I mean, one of the new theses is can it work in the UK, right? Yep. Because in the US, part of the program is about inoculating or vaccinating people from academic culture. Because academic culture is very conservative. You're not really supposed to think different. Audacity is converted into pragmatism. And so part of the program sort of inoculates them from that culture so that if they want to start a startup, they can. In the UK, we'll have to inoculate people not only from academic culture, but also from British culture. And so, it's like an additional lift. And so I think we can do it. That's why we're launching the program. But that's going to be a new thesis, and we're going to have to prove that out.
And you mentioned that you had got financing to do it in the UK, but was that the main driver for why UK and why Europe, as opposed to rolling this out further across the US?
So, the UK is interesting because it has 3 of the top 10 research universities in the world. and it has basically no deep tech startup ecosystem. So it is, without a doubt, the largest gap in the world between quality of research and robustness of deep tech ecosystem, right? And so that's the reason we're really excited to bring it there first, is because if we can close that gap, then we can create a huge amount of societal value and economic value. And it sort of feels to us like, oh man, if it doesn't work there, that maybe it shouldn't work anywhere else, right? Because like there's no other place where you have that extreme of a dynamic, not even in the United States. And so that's why we're bringing it to the UK first. Aria was the one that sort of turned us onto that and made the case. And already the reception we've gotten there, we've now visited Cambridge and Oxford, Imperial, and University College London, and are soon going to go to some of the other sort of schools not on the research triangle. And we're just hearing over and over and over again of like, yes, there is this latent sort of desire to do this, but there's no one in our ecosystem that gives us any support.
Super interesting. And I mean, but also like beyond that, you mentioned vaccinating from UK culture, but what are your observations now being based in the UK on like what are the main things that Europe could learn from the US and potentially the other way around?
So, the UK culture is actually quite conservative. If you are super audacious, you're sort of like encouraged to be more pragmatic immediately by almost everyone in the ecosystem. In Silicon Valley, if you say some very audacious idea, the default reaction is, oh, and if you did that, you know what else you could do, right? It's almost like bigger, bigger, bigger. And in the UK, it's sort of like, oh, that seems very unlikely to work. Let's try and figure out something that's likely to work, right? And the whole idea of startups is that they are these very high risk, but very high expected value things, right? Because you can take a big risk, but man, if it works, it really works. And for that type of thing, you don't want to be super pragmatic in your mission, right? And so I think that's a big problem. In the UK, there's literally a class system, right? Which is not great, because I think any sort of strong startup ecosystem needs a boost of counterculture, because if you don't have counterculture, then what exists is good, what is big is good. And then I think the biggest issue with the UK is that failure is really frowned upon. Like people really don't want to fail, because if you have a failure on your LinkedIn, it is like something you have to explain over and over and over again. Like in the Silicon Valley, people literally don't even ask about failures, right? And I think part of that is the Silicon Valley ethos, but part of it is also the American ethos of, in grade school, we're taught about Abraham Lincoln, who is, known to be the greatest U.S. president by most surveys, ended the Civil War, freed the slaves. He ran for office 5 times and lost. He bankrupted a company and then went on to become the greatest US president, right? And the lesson we're taught there is as long as you keep trying big things, doesn't matter if you fail, just keep doing that, right? And Lincoln did it, right? And so from like a very young age, we're indoctrinated with this idea of like failure doesn't really matter so long as you're trying really big things. That culture does not exist at all in the UK. And so I think that's like, it's very hard to change. I think that's probably going to be the biggest challenge for us.
And I suppose that on a day like today, where we all woke up to the news about the election, I also have to ask, how do you think this will impact the US and the ecosystem there?
Well, I think it's really, it's just bad, really bad. It's bad for the world. It is, I remain very optimistic about things, but I think it'd be silly to say that this doesn't sort of set back the idea of using technology as a force for good. I think climate tech is going to be set back quite a lot, because we have a literal climate change denier now in the Oval Office again. He has, throughout his career, he sort of switched recently, but he has had some extremely anti-immigrant rhetoric in the past, and has suggested some very aggressively anti-immigrant policies. And if you look at America, the reason America has the economy it does is because the best and the brightest from around the world choose to come there. It's just it's such an obvious strength. For some reason, he doesn't see it that way, even though to me it's just almost like an empirical fact. And so we'll see what policies he enacts. He's sort of said he's going to tone that down a bit, but I'm not so sure. And then I think it's just people want to be in a country where they're proud of that place, and I think it's hard to be proud of a place when the leader is sort of like a very small person who belittles and threatens and name calls and all that jazz. But for me, I look at history, and we've had dark times before in America. 1942, we literally passed a law, Executive Order 9066, which allowed for the internment of Japanese Americans. So we literally interned 120,000 Japanese Americans, forced them from their homes, put them in camps behind barbed wire. 2/3 of those people were citizens, right? It got this guy, Fred Karamatsu, refused to do it, and he got convicted, and he took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. You think like, oh, obviously you can't take someone just because they're Japanese, and the Supreme Court ruled 6-3. No, it's fine. The government can do this. Right? That was like a really, really dark time for America. But you look at what happened just like years later. It took too long, but like years later, he got his conviction overturned, and he was awarded by Bill Clinton the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor. And some of the people that literally were interned went on to become U.S. congressmen, went on to become treasury secretaries, went on to become leaders in business. George Takei, who's like a star of Star Trek, went on to be one of the cultural icons of America. And it happened fairly quickly, right? So we've had really tough times in America before, and we've always, through resilience, overcome and sort of emerged stronger at the end of it. But I would be lying if I said it's not like a big bummer. And I do worry, especially for climate companies, that it will set things back quite a lot.
And for the years to come, are there any particular areas that you are hopeful about, that with the work you're doing now in deep tech, that here is really a potential to make big strides if we manage to get more of the research out?
We really try and avoid, one of our core values is beginner's mind, because if we form opinions about what sectors will be big or not, I think the only thing I'm sure of is we'll be wrong. There's an idea in venture called thesis-driven investing, right? So there's a firm called Accel that's really good at this. And if you're, say, a software firm and your specialty is digitizing industries that haven't been digitized, I think that kind of investing works well, because you can say, okay, what companies are still using fax, or what companies are still using pen and paper, and then what digital tools would solve that, and then we're going to go find those digital tools and introduce them to that company. That's called thesis-driven investing, right? Where you have like a top-down view of the world. In deep tech, I just don't think it works, because the nature of every really fundamental deep tech innovation was that it just literally wasn't possible until 5 to 10 people in a lab figured out how to make it possible. And so if a VC sort of goes, oh, where's the world heading, and like what things are going to be important, like they're going to be wrong, because they're not going to be one of those 5 to 10 people. If you look at like recombinant DNA, the transistor, the World Wide Web, all these things were like super surprising, right, before they became kind of inevitable. And so we really try and prevent ourselves from forming those opinions, and instead focus on building a ton of value for the people that are likely to have those breakthroughs, the scientists, the engineers, so that when they have that breakthrough, they tell us about it, and then we need to have the capabilities, technical and otherwise, to sort of see if we agree with their vision of the future, and if we do, hopefully we get a chance to support them.
And like I mentioned, in this audience, you're allowed to brag. So if you were to give us some examples, so like throughout the journey, both with 50 years and the unicorns, and from the 50/50 program now more recently, perhaps earlier on the journey. But what would be some of the cases that you would say that, wow, this really makes me proud of what we've achieved to date?
Yeah, I mean, we have a company called Billion to One, which was founded by a Stanford PhD who figured out a way of detecting tiny amounts of DNA in blood, free-floating DNA in blood. And this has a huge number of applications. The two that they're scaling currently is in prenatal diagnostics. You often want to see if there are certain genetic defects so that the woman can make decisions around their pregnancy. They can detect these defects far earlier than anyone else. And other technologies, they can basically say, oh, you might have Down syndrome, your child might have Down syndrome, right? And then the next step is something called amniocentesis, where you take this really long needle and you have to poke it into the fetus to get cells. And it's a fairly dangerous procedure, it's invasive, sometimes leads to miscarriages. Because their technology is so accurate, you just literally don't have to do amniocentesis anymore. So this incredibly scary, sort of high-risk thing, it's just gone, right? And now they launched the product about 4 years ago. They've scaled to over 100 million annual revenue in 4 years, which is super fast. And this is a deep tech company. And they recently launched applications in oncology, where they can detect cancer and what the most effective treatment will be using the exact same technology. Another company we're really proud of is a company called Solugen. They chemi-enzymatically make industrial chemicals. So they basically combine heterogeneous metacatalysis, which is a trick from the oil and gas industry, with enzymology, which is a trick from synthetic biology, and they combine them in these reactors such that you can feed these reactors plant sugars, and the reactors crank out industrial chemicals. It's way more sustainable than petrochemistry. In some use cases, it's actually carbon negative. We were there, we had the good fortune to be their first investor. They've now scaled, they're a $2 billion company. They have a beautiful, 63-foot tall, I got to convert that to meters, plant in Houston, Texas that cranks out tens of thousands of tons per year of their chemicals. And they just got approved for a $250 million loan from the DOE to build a massive plant in the middle of the country. And what's cool is it's the same loan that Tesla got. It's just exactly half the size, which I think means they're soon to be half the size of Tesla's market cap. I think that's the way that works. That's a really cool company. And then out of 50/50, in the first cohort, there was a postdoc at Caltech who had figured out a new way of doing plasmid sequencing. Plasmid sequencing is basically a core part of every bioengineer's workflow. Plasmids are these circular pieces of DNA, and you have to sequence them, i.e. read them, if you want to do any sort of bioengineering, and you read them all the time. And before this company, the way they were read was with these machines called Sanger sequencers, which, long story short, were designed in the 70s, and they were just terrible. They were slow, they're expensive, they would give you the wrong readout, so they would tell you the genes were one thing, but really they're another thing, which if you're an academic lab might cost you 6 months, if you're Novartis, might cost you like $6 million. And so it was always a headache for every bioengineer, and this founder figured out a better way of doing it. It's cheap, it's fast, it literally works every time, and they were founded 3 years ago, and from founding, they now have customers in all 50 states, and I think now every European country. They have labs in Los Angeles, in South San Francisco, in San Diego, in Boston, in Seattle, in Kentucky, in London, and are opening up one in Germany and soon in Singapore. And they have been cash flow positive every single month of their existence, which is exciting for us because you often hear that deep tech companies can't make money for a really long time, which sometimes is true, but it's often the case just not true at all. And then the thing that makes us most proud is that every Nobel Prize winning biology lab in the US is using them, this company called Plasmidsaurus, and they did an analysis and found that they are cutting 1 day per week off of the iteration cycle of those labs. And if you think about what those labs are working on, right, it's cures for cancer, it's sustainable methods of production, it's new ways of making food, new ways of diagnosing disease. These are really important things. And so if you can save a day per week for people doing such important stuff, you can have a radically cool impact. Then I have tens of thousands of scientists that they're doing this for.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And the program now in Europe, it's open for applications, or?
Yeah, it's open for applications. Right now, unfortunately, just for the UK, but sign up for the mailing list. We'll let you know. And we're open. The applications are actually, you can sign up, but the applications will open in January, and then the program will actually launch in February.
And for the people in this room who would love to team up with you in any way or the other, is the best thing people can do to just recommend people to apply to the program, or anything else?
Yeah, there's a few ways. So first, if you're building a deep tech company that can become civilizationally important and you're at the very early stages, definitely let us know about that. If you know brilliant PhDs or postdocs or engineers or scientists in the UK, if you could point them to the 50/50 program, that would be great. And then we're also hiring a team of 6 people in the UK to actually run the program. And so if you heard about that program and you're like, oh, wow, that sounds super exciting, I would love to support that, but I'm not a scientist, get in touch because we need great people to help us run it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming here. And we will continue the conversation in the Speak Easy for any follow-up questions.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.